The first gunshot of the night tore through the saloon window, shattering Pearl Jenkins' already broken world. It was 1878, and Dry Creek, Montana was no place for a young widow with a 3-month-old baby. But Pearl had nowhere else to go after her husband, Thomas, was killed in a mining accident just weeks after their son was born. Pearl clutched baby Samuel to her chest, shielding him from the flying glass as more gunfire erupted outside. The usual Friday night brawl between cowboys fresh off the trail was in full swing, and Pearl's tiny rented room above the general store offered little protection from the chaos below. "Hush now, my sweet boy," she whispered, rocking Samuel gently as his face scrunched up, ready to wail. Pearl began to sing softly, the same lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child. "Golden slumber kiss your eyes, smiles await you when you rise." Her voice, clear and sweet despite her exhaustion, floated through the room. Samuel's cries subsided as he gazed up at his mother with wide, trusting eyes. Outside, the gunfire had stopped, but the shouting continued. Pearl kept singing, her voice growing slightly stronger as she moved to the window and peered cautiously down at the dusty Main Street. Several cowboys were being dragged toward the sheriff's office, while others nursed bloody knuckles and split lips. Pearl sighed. This was not the life she had envisioned when Thomas had brought her west from Boston 2 years ago, full of dreams about silver strikes and a fine house with a garden. Now she was 23, widowed, with only her son and the meager wages she earned doing laundry and mending for the townsfolk. Samuel finally drifted to sleep, his tiny fingers curled around one of hers. Pearl gently placed him in the rough-hewn cradle Thomas had made before he died and covered him with a patchwork quilt. She moved to the small table where her sewing waited. The general store owner's wife had given her a pile of shirts to mend, and Pearl needed the money for milk and flour. As the night deepened, Pearl continued her work by lamplight, occasionally pausing to sing softly when Samuel stirred. She didn't notice the figure standing in the shadows across the street, listening to her voice carrying through the open window. Dawn broke over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Pearl had managed only a few hours of fitful sleep before Samuel's hungry cries woke her. After feeding him and changing his tiny clothes, she wrapped him in a soft blanket and prepared to face another day. Mrs. Holbrook, the preacher's wife, had asked Pearl to come by after church to discuss some sewing work. Pearl couldn't afford to miss the opportunity, but Sunday services had become an ordeal since Thomas' death. The pitying glances, the whispers behind hands, and worst of all, the scathing remarks from Cordelia Winters, the banker's wife, who seemed to consider Pearl's widowhood a personal affront. "Come along, Samuel," Pearl murmured, tucking the baby against her shoulder. "We must be brave today." The church stood at the end of Main Street, its white steeple reaching toward the cloudless sky. Pearl slipped into the back pew just as Reverend Holbrook began the first hymn. Samuel was mercifully quiet, his eyes wide as he took in the stained glass windows and the sound of the congregation singing. Pearl kept her gaze forward, though she could feel Cordelia Winters' disapproving stare from the front row. The service passed in a blur, Pearl's thoughts drifting between worry about the coming winter and memories of sitting in this same church with Thomas, his strong hand holding hers, his smile bright with promise. "Mrs. Jenkins." Pearl looked up to find Reverend Holbrook standing beside her pew, his kind face creased with concern. "Reverend," she acknowledged, rising to her feet with Samuel balanced carefully in her arms. "How are you managing, my dear? Is there anything the church can do to assist you and little Samuel?" Before Pearl could answer, Cordelia Winters appeared at the Reverend's elbow, her expensive blue dress rustling importantly. Perhaps Mrs. Jenkins could consider placing her child with a proper family, Cordelia suggested, her voice carrying throughout the nearly empty church. A widow with no means has no business raising a child alone. Pearl's face flushed hot with anger and humiliation. I am managing quite well, thank you, Mrs. Winters, she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. Samuel is my son, and he will remain with me. Cordelia's thin lips pressed together in disapproval. Well, I certainly hope you intend to stop that unseemly singing at all hours. The whole town can hear you caterwauling to that baby. My husband says it's most disturbing to hear a woman's voice floating through the streets after dark. Most improper. Pearl clutched Samuel tighter, speechless with indignation. The lullabies were the only comfort she could offer her fatherless son, and now even that was being criticized. Reverend Holbrook cleared his throat uncomfortably. Now, Mrs. Winters, I'm sure Mrs. Jenkins is doing her best in difficult circumstances of her own making, Cordelia interrupted. If she had not encouraged her husband to pursue that foolish mining venture, he might still be alive. The unfairness of the accusation stole Pearl's breath. She had never encouraged Thomas to work in the dangerous silver mine. In fact, she had begged him to find other work. But the promise of quick wealth had been too tempting, and Thomas had been determined to provide a better life for his growing family. "Excuse me," Pearl managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She pushed past Cordelia and hurried from the church, tears blurring her vision. Outside, the bright sunlight felt like a mockery of her dark mood. Pearl walked swiftly toward the small creek that gave the town its name, needing a moment of peace before she could face Mrs. Holbrook about the sewing work. The creek bubbled cheerfully over smooth stones, its banks lined with cottonwood trees that provided welcome shade. Pearl found a flat rock and sat down, arranging Samuel in her lap so he could look up at the dancing leaves. "Don't you listen to that old crow," she told her son, brushing a finger over his downy cheek. "Your papa loved us very much, and I will always take care of you, no matter what anyone says." Samuel cooed in response, his tiny hands waving in the air. Pearl smiled through her tears and began to sing to him, her voice mingling with the sound of the flowing water. "Down in the valley, valley so low, hang your head over, hear the wind blow. That's mighty pretty singing, madam." Pearl gasped and jumped to her feet, nearly losing her balance on the uneven ground. A tall man stood a few yards away, his hat in his hands. He was dressed in the dusty clothes of a cowboy, worn leather chaps over denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and boots that had seen many miles. His face was partly shadowed by several days' worth of beard, but his eyes were startlingly blue against his sun-browned skin. "I'm sorry to frighten you," he said, taking a step back. "I was just passing by and heard your voice." Pearl gathered Samuel closer, immediately wary. "I should be getting back to town," she said, looking past the stranger to the path leading back to Dry Creek. "No need to run off on my account," the man said, his voice gentle. "Name's Dustin Drake. Just rode in with a herd from Wyoming, heading up to the Rockingham Ranch to see about work." Pearl hesitated. The Rockingham was owned by Malcolm Morris, one of the most respected ranchers in the territory. If this man was looking for work there, he was likely legitimate, but she had learned to be cautious around strange men. "Pearl Jenkins," she replied finally. "And this is my son, Samuel." Dustin smiled, and the expression transformed his trail-worn face, revealing a dimple in his right cheek. "Pleased to meet you both, Mrs. Jenkins. That's a fine boy you have there." Pearl relaxed slightly. Anyone who spoke kindly about her son couldn't be all bad. "Thank you, Mr. Drake. Just Dustin, please. Mr. Drake was my father, and he was a much more respectable man than I'll ever be." His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled again. "I hope you don't mind my saying so, but your singing is the sweetest thing I've heard in months of hard trail riding." Pearl felt color rise in her cheeks. After Cordelia's harsh criticism, this unexpected compliment caught her off guard. "It's just an old lullaby, nothing special." "Sounded special to me," Dustin said simply. He replaced his hat on his head and touched the brim in a polite gesture. "I should let you get back to your Sunday. Maybe I'll see you around town, Mrs. Jenkins." Pearl watched him walk away, his long stride carrying him quickly toward the main road. There was something in his bearing that spoke of quiet strength, reminding her painfully of Thomas. She pushed the thought away and turned back toward town. She couldn't afford to think of such things. Her priority had to be Samuel and their survival. Mrs. Holbrook was waiting on the church steps, her round face anxious. "There you are, Pearl. I was worried when you disappeared so suddenly." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Holbrook," Pearl said. "I needed a moment of fresh air." The older woman patted her arm sympathetically. "Never you mind Cordelia Winters. That woman has a tongue sharp enough to cut glass. Now, come along to the parsonage. I have some dresses that need altering, and Reverend Holbrook's shirts always need mending. That man tears through elbows like no one I've ever seen." Pearl followed the preacher's wife to the small house beside the church, grateful for the woman's kindness and the promise of paid work. As they walked, she found herself glancing around, half expecting to see Dustin Drake watching her. But the cowboy was nowhere to be seen. The following week passed in a blur of laundry, mending, and caring for Samuel. Pearl rose before dawn each day to start the washing while her son still slept, then spent the afternoons at her needle. By the time evening fell, she was exhausted, but Samuel often grew fussy after sunset, leaving Pearl to pace the small room, singing softly to soothe him. It was on one such evening, just as the last light faded from the sky, that Pearl heard the first sharp rap on her door. Startled, she clutched Samuel tighter and approached cautiously. "Who's there?" she called. "It's Cordelia Winters, Mrs. Jenkins. Open this door immediately." Pearl's heart sank. She had been avoiding the banker's wife since their encounter at church. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door to find Cordelia standing on the landing, flanked by two other women from the Ladies' Aid Society. "Mrs. Jenkins," Cordelia said, her tone making the name sound like an accusation. "We have come to discuss your behavior." "My behavior?" Pearl repeated, bewildered. She stepped back to allow the women into her small room, though she wanted nothing more than to close the door in their pinched faces. "Yes, your behavior," Cordelia confirmed, looking around the room with obvious distaste. "It has come to our attention that you continue to sing inappropriately after dark, and now we hear you have been seen in the company of a strange cowboy down by the creek. Alone and unchaperoned." Pearl's mouth fell open in shock. "I was singing lullabies to my son," she said, her voice shaking with indignation. "And I exchanged perhaps 3 sentences with a man who happened to pass by while I was sitting by the creek. There was nothing improper about either situation." Mrs. Peterson, the blacksmith's wife, cleared her throat nervously. "It's just that, as a young widow, you must be especially careful of your reputation, Pearl, for the sake of your child." "My reputation," Pearl repeated, incredulous. "I have done nothing wrong." "You were heard singing to that cowboy," Cordelia said triumphantly. "Mrs. Daniels was gathering berries and saw the whole scandalous encounter." Pearl struggled to maintain her composure. "I was singing to my son," she said again, enunciating each word clearly. "The man merely commented on my singing as he passed by. It was a chance encounter that lasted less than 5 minutes." "Nevertheless," Cordelia continued, as though Pearl hadn't spoken, The Ladies' Aid Society feels it is our Christian duty to offer you guidance. A proper widow observes a period of mourning for at least 1 year, during which she avoids all male company except close relatives. She certainly does not draw attention to herself by singing in public places. Pearl looked down at Samuel, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, blissfully unaware of the women's condemnation. She thought of the endless days stretching ahead, filled with grief and loneliness, and of her son growing up believing his mother's voice was something to be ashamed of. "I appreciate your concern," she said quietly, meeting Cordelia's cold stare. "But I will continue to sing to my son whenever he needs comfort. As for avoiding male company, I will be civil to any person who treats me with respect, regardless of their gender. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to put Samuel down for the night." Cordelia's face flushed an unattractive shade of purple. "Well, I never. You can be certain my husband will hear about this insolence. Perhaps, when Mr. Winters calls in the loan on this property, you will reconsider your attitude." The threat hung in the air as the women filed out, leaving Pearl trembling in the center of the room. The building belonged to Mr. Winters, who had allowed Pearl to stay in the small room at a reduced rent out of respect for Thomas. If he evicted her, she would have nowhere to go. Pearl gently laid Samuel in his cradle and sank onto her narrow bed. For the first time since Thomas' death, she allowed herself to weep openly, burying her face in her pillow to muffle the sound. The unfairness of it all crashed over her in waves. Thomas taken too soon, left alone to raise their child, and now facing the prospect of homelessness because she dared to sing lullabies to her baby. When her tears finally subsided, Pearl sat up and wiped her face. She would not be broken by Cordelia Winters or anyone else. Tomorrow she would speak to Sheriff Miller about finding additional work, perhaps cooking or cleaning at the jail. She would find a way to support herself and Samuel, even if it meant leaving Dry Creek altogether. With renewed determination, Pearl began to prepare for bed. As she moved around the small room, she hummed softly under her breath, a quiet act of defiance against those who would silence her. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the first hint of autumn crispness in the air. Pearl dressed quickly, bundled Samuel warmly, and headed to the sheriff's office as soon as she had fed him. Sheriff Miller was a fair man who had been a friend to Thomas, and Pearl hoped he might have some suggestions for additional work. The sheriff's office sat midway down Main Street, a solid brick building that also housed the town jail. As Pearl approached, she was surprised to see several horses tied to the hitching post outside, including a magnificent black stallion with a white blaze on its forehead. She hesitated, wondering if this was a bad time to approach the sheriff, but her need for work outweighed her caution. Squaring her shoulders, Pearl pushed open the door and stepped inside. Sheriff Miller looked up from his desk, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he saw her. "Mrs. Jenkins, what a pleasant surprise, and you've brought young Samuel too, I see." "Good morning, Sheriff," Pearl said, relieved by his warm welcome. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," Sheriff Miller assured her, rising from his chair. "I was just finishing up with Mr. Morris and his new ranch hand." Pearl turned to see Malcolm Morris, owner of the Rockingham Ranch, sitting across from the sheriff's desk. Beside him, hat in hand, stood Dustin Drake, the cowboy from the creek. His blue eyes widened in recognition as he saw Pearl. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, inclining his head respectfully. "Good to see you again." Malcolm Morris, a tall man with silver streaking his dark hair, looked between Dustin and Pearl with interest. "You two are acquainted." "We met briefly by the creek on Sunday," Pearl explained, conscious of Cordelia's accusation of impropriety. Mr. Drake was kind enough to compliment my singing. Kindness had nothing to do with it, Dustin said, his expression earnest. It was the truth. Mrs. Jenkins has the voice of an angel. Pearl felt heat rising in her cheeks at his open admiration. Sheriff Miller chuckled, breaking the moment of awkward silence. "What brings you to see me today, Mrs. Jenkins?" he asked, gesturing for her to take a seat. Pearl shifted Samuel in her arms, suddenly aware of how her request for work might appear to these successful men, but pride would not feed her son. "I was hoping you might know of any additional work available in town," she said. "I've been taking in laundry and mending, but with winter coming, I need to earn more to provide for Samuel." Sheriff Miller's face softened with sympathy. "Thomas would be proud of your resourcefulness, Pearl. Let me think on it. The jail doesn't have much need for a woman's touch, but perhaps Mrs. Miller could use help with her boarding house." "Actually," Malcolm Morris interjected, "my wife has been complaining about the state of our ranch house. With roundup season ending, we'll have the hands coming in from the line camps, and the place needs a thorough cleaning and some mending done. Would you consider coming out to the Rockingham a few days a week?" Pearl blinked in surprise. The Rockingham was one of the largest ranches in the territory, a good 5 miles outside of town. "That's very kind, Mr. Morris, but I don't have any way to get out to your ranch." "I could fetch you," Dustin offered immediately. "I ride into town regular for supplies anyway. It would be no trouble." Malcolm nodded approvingly. "There you have it. Drake here can bring you out to the ranch on Mondays and Thursdays and return you to town before dark. My wife will pay you fair wages, and you'd get a hot meal as part of the bargain." Pearl hesitated, torn between gratitude for the opportunity and awareness of how such an arrangement might be perceived by the likes of Cordelia Winters. But the prospect of regular meals and wages was too tempting to refuse. "That's very generous, Mr. Morris," she said finally. "I would be pleased to help Mrs. Morris with the ranch house." "Excellent." Malcolm clapped his hands together. "Drake will come for you on Monday morning then." 8 o'clock suit you?" Pearl nodded, still somewhat dazed by this sudden change in her prospects. Samuel squirmed in her arms and she adjusted her hold on him. "May I?" Dustin asked, holding his arms out tentatively. At Pearl's surprised look, he added, "I've got 6 younger siblings. Helped raise most of them after our ma passed." Somewhat reluctantly, Pearl allowed Dustin to take Samuel. The baby looked tiny in the cowboy's large hands, but Dustin held him with practiced ease, tucking him securely against his broad chest. Samuel stared up at the stranger, his tiny brow furrowed in concentration. "Hello there, little man," Dustin said softly. "You're a lucky fellow having a mama with such a beautiful voice." He looked up at Pearl, his expression serious. "My own mother used to sing to us every night. Those songs were sometimes the only thing that got us through the hard times." Something in his tone made Pearl think there had been many hard times in Dustin Drake's life. She felt a sudden kinship with this tall cowboy who understood the power of a mother's song. "Well, we should be getting on," Malcolm said, breaking the moment. "Mrs. Morris will be expecting us back for the noon meal. Mrs. Jenkins, we'll see you on Monday." Pearl reclaimed Samuel and watched as the men said their farewells to the sheriff. As Dustin passed her on his way out, he paused briefly. "Don't stop singing, Mrs. Jenkins," he said quietly. "This world needs more beauty in it, not less." With that, he was gone, following Malcolm Morris out into the bright morning sunlight. Pearl stared after him, a strange flutter in her chest that she hadn't felt since Thomas first courted her. "He's a good man," Sheriff Miller said, noting her expression. "Malcolm says he's the best horseman he's seen in 20 years. Rode in with the Bryant outfit from Wyoming, but he's originally from Kentucky." Pearl nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She thanked the sheriff for his help and left the office, her mind whirling with thoughts of Monday's visit to the Rocking M and the cowboy who would take her there. Sunday found Pearl once again at church, though she took care to arrive just as the service began and left immediately after the final hymn, avoiding any further confrontations with Cordelia Winters. She spent the afternoon preparing for her first day at the Rocking M, laying out her best work dress and checking that Samuel's clothes were clean and mended. As dusk fell, Pearl fed Samuel and settled him in his cradle, singing softly as was her custom. Tonight, however, she found herself wondering if somewhere in the gathering darkness, a certain blue-eyed cowboy might be listening. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird." Pearl's sweet voice carried on the evening breeze, drifting out her open window and down to the street below, where indeed Dustin Drake leaned against a hitching post, his face tilted up toward her window, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Monday morning arrived with a spectacular sunrise that painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson. Pearl was up before dawn, eager and nervous about her first day at the Rocking M. She dressed carefully in her blue calico work dress, braided her long hair and pinned it up neatly, then prepared Samuel for the journey. At precisely 8 o'clock, the sound of hoofbeats in the street below announced Dustin's arrival. Pearl gathered Samuel and her small bundle of supplies, clean aprons, her sewing kit, and a shawl in case the weather turned, and made her way downstairs. Dustin waited beside a sturdy bay gelding, the same black stallion from the sheriff's office tethered nearby. He doffed his hat as Pearl approached, his blue eyes warm with greeting. "Good morning, Mrs. Jenkins," he said. "You and young Samuel ready for your big adventure?" Pearl smiled despite her nervousness. "Good morning, Mr. Drake. Yes, we're ready, though I confess I'm not much of a horsewoman." "I grew up in Boston, you see." Dustin nodded, as if this explained many things about her. "No need to worry, madam. Old Copper here is gentle as a lamb. I brought him special instead of my usual mount." He patted the bay's neck affectionately. "And please call me Dustin. Mr. Drake makes me feel like I ought to be wearing a fancy suit instead of these trail duds." Pearl hesitated, acutely aware of propriety. "That's very kind, but perhaps it would be best if we maintained formalities. People in town are already talking." A shadow crossed Dustin's face. "Folks got nothing better to do than gossip about a widow trying to raise her child honest." He shook his head in disgust. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Jenkins. It's not my place to comment. Now let me help you up." With Samuel securely cradled in one arm, Pearl allowed Dustin to boost her onto Copper's back. The saddle was obviously meant for a man, but Dustin had thoughtfully added a folded blanket to make it more comfortable for her. Once she was settled, he handed Samuel up to her, then untied the black stallion and mounted with effortless grace. "Ready?" he asked, bringing his horse alongside Copper. Pearl nodded, adjusting her hold on Samuel and the reins. "Ready." The ride to the Rocking M took just over an hour, with Dustin setting a gentle pace out of consideration for Pearl and the baby. As they traveled, he pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the territory. Pearl found herself laughing at his tales of cowboy mishaps and admiring his obvious love for the rugged landscape. "So what brought you west from Boston?" Dustin asked as they crested a low hill that revealed the sprawling Rocking M ranch in the valley below. Pearl's smile faded slightly. "My husband, Thomas. He had dreams of making our fortune in silver mining. We met when he came east to secure investors for a mining venture. I was working as a seamstress for a wealthy family, and Thomas was invited to dinner to discuss business." She paused, remembering. "He said he knew he would marry me the moment he saw me. We were wed within a month, and I came west with him shortly after. A whirlwind romance, Dustin commented. Yes, I suppose it was, Pearl agreed. My parents had both passed, and I had no siblings. There was nothing to keep me in Boston, and everything about Thomas pulled me west. And the mining venture, Pearl shook her head sadly. It failed like so many others. Thomas took work in other men's mines to make ends meet. That's where he was killed just 3 months ago. A cave-in. I'm mighty sorry for your loss, Mrs. Jenkins, Dustin said, his voice gentle. Sounds like Thomas was a good man. He was, Pearl said simply. The best man I've ever known. They rode in companionable silence for a time until Samuel began to fuss. Pearl soothed him with a soft song, and the baby quieted immediately, his eyes fixed on his mother's face. That's a special gift you have, Dustin observed. Your voice seems to reach right into a person's soul. Pearl blushed at the compliment. It's nothing special. Just a mother's love for her child. Begging your pardon, but I disagree, Dustin said firmly. Some folks sing and it's just noise. When you sing, it's like hearing something from heaven itself. Before Pearl could respond to this extraordinary statement, they arrived at the ranch house, a substantial 2-story structure built of logs and local stone. A woman emerged onto the wide porch as they approached, shading her eyes against the morning sun. That's Mrs. Morris, Dustin explained. Don't let her gruff manner fool you. She's got a heart as big as Montana Territory. Leaner Morris proved to be a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and shrewd brown eyes that took in Pearl's appearance with one comprehensive glance. So you're Thomas Jenkins' widow, she said without preamble once the introductions were complete. Heard you're good with a needle and not afraid of hard work. That true? Yes, madam, Pearl replied, standing straight despite her fatigue from the unaccustomed horseback ride. I'm grateful for the opportunity to prove my worth. Aliner's stern expression softened slightly. No need for madam here. Call me Aliner, and this must be young Samuel. She peered at the baby in Pearl's arms. Strong-looking boy, got his father's chin, I see. Pearl blinked back sudden tears. It was the first time anyone had commented on Samuel's resemblance to Thomas, and the observation touched her deeply. Drake, get those horses sorted and then come back for lunch, Aliner instructed. Pearl, come inside and we'll discuss what needs doing. The ranch house was spacious, but in desperate need of a woman's touch. Malcolm and Aliner's 4 children were all grown and gone, leaving the couple alone in the big house, except for the occasional ranch hand who took meals with them. Aliner had been managing the household alone while also helping Malcolm with ranch business, and the strange showed in the dusty corners and haphazardly mended curtains. Start with the main room, Aliner directed, gesturing to the large open space that served as both dining room and gathering place. Dust everything, sweep and mop the floor, and those curtains need taking down for washing. We've got hands coming in from the line camps tomorrow, and Malcolm likes to have the place looking decent. Pearl set to work immediately, creating a makeshift bed for Samuel from a dresser drawer lined with soft blankets. The baby watched contentedly as his mother transformed the neglected room, her deft hands making quick work of the dust and disorder. By noon, the main room was spotless. The curtains had been washed and rehung, and Pearl had started on the kitchen. Aliner, who had been working on accounts in her husband's study, emerged to check Pearl's progress and nodded approvingly. You're as good as they say, she commented. Come sit and have some lunch. The men will be in shortly. Sure enough, Malcolm and Dustin arrived moments later, accompanied by 2 other cowboys. Pearl sat quietly at the end of the long table, Samuel on her lap, as Aliner served a hearty meal of beans, corn bread, and apple pie. "Drake here tells me you're from Boston originally," Malcolm said to Pearl as they ate. "Must be quite a change, coming to Montana territory." "Yes, it is," Pearl agreed. "But there's a beauty to this land that grows on you. I don't think I could go back to the city now." "And you're singing," Dustin added. "Drake says you've got a voice that would make angels envious." Pearl felt her cheeks grow warm. "Mr. Drake is too kind." "Don't recall Drake ever being accused of excessive kindness before," one of the other cowboys commented with a chuckle. "Must be something special about your singing, madam." "It is," Dustin said firmly, his blue eyes meeting Pearl's across the table. "Most special thing I've heard in all my years of wandering." The conviction in his voice silenced the good-natured teasing, and conversation turned to ranch matters. Pearl found herself sneaking glances at Dustin throughout the meal, intrigued by the contrast between his rough exterior and the sensitivity he showed when speaking about her music. After lunch, the men returned to their work, and Pearl continued with the cleaning. By late afternoon, she had made significant progress on the main floor of the house. Alina pronounced herself delighted with Pearl's work and paid her generously in silver dollars. "You'll come back Thursday," Alina confirmed as Pearl prepared to leave. "Yes, I'll be here," Pearl promised. "Thank you for the opportunity, Alina." Dustin was waiting outside with the horses. The ride back to town was quieter than the morning journey, both Pearl and Dustin lost in their own thoughts. As the buildings of Dry Creek came into view, Pearl broke the silence. "Thank you for escorting me today, Mr. Drake. I appreciate your kindness." Dustin glanced at her, his expression unusually serious. "It's no hardship spending time in your company, Mrs. Jenkins, and I meant what I said about your singing. It's something special." Pearl looked down at Samuel, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Why does it matter so much to you? My singing, I mean." Dustin was quiet for so long that Pearl thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "When I was just a boy, maybe 7 or 8, my pa took to drinking after the crops failed. He'd come home mean, looking to take out his anger on anyone nearby. Usually that was my ma." Pearl's heart ached at the pain evident in his voice, but she remained silent, letting him continue at his own pace. "One night he was worse than usual. Had me and my brothers huddled in a corner, terrified. Ma put herself between us and Pa, took a beating that should have killed her." Dustin's hands tightened on the reins. "When he finally passed out, we thought she was dead too, but then she started singing. Just a soft, broken whisper at first, then stronger. It was a hymn about God's mercy. Her face was bloody, one eye swollen shut, and she sang like she was in heaven already." He looked at Pearl, his blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "That song saved my soul that night, Mrs. Jenkins. Made me believe there was still goodness in the world, even with all the ugliness right in front of me. So when I heard you singing to your boy by that creek, it brought it all back. Reminded me that beauty can exist alongside sorrow." Pearl was deeply moved by his story and the raw emotion in his voice. "I'm so sorry for what you endured, Mr. Drake. No child should witness such things." Dustin shrugged, as if shaking off the painful memories. "It was a long time ago. Ma died the following winter. Pneumonia, they said, but I think her spirit just gave out. Pa drank himself to death a year later, left me to raise my siblings best I could." "And did you? Raise them, I mean." A small, proud smile lifted the corner of his mouth. "I did. Oldest brother's a school teacher in Nebraska now. Sister married a storekeeper in Colorado. 2 youngest brothers joined the Army. They all turned out fine despite everything." "Thanks to you," Pearl said softly. Dustin shook his head. "Thanks to my ma's songs. They kept hope alive in all of us." They had reached the edge of town now. Pearl was acutely conscious of curious eyes watching as Dustin escorted her down Main Street to the general store. She could almost hear Cordelia Winter's voice condemning her for riding alone with a man not her husband. "I can make my way from here," she said, stopping at the edge of town. "Thank you again, Mr. Drake." Dustin looked as if he wanted to protest, but after a moment he nodded in understanding. "As you wish, Mrs. Jenkins. I'll come for you Thursday morning, same time." He helped her down from Copper, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a brief moment they stood close together, Pearl looking up into his weathered face, something unspoken passing between them. Then she stepped back, clutching Samuel to her chest like a shield. "Good day, Mr. Drake," she said, her voice not entirely steady. "Good day, Mrs. Jenkins," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. "Take care of that boy, and don't stop singing to him no matter what anyone says." Pearl watched him ride away, her thoughts in turmoil. Thomas had been gone only 3 months, yet here she was, her heart racing at the touch of another man's hands. The realization brought both guilt and confusion. She loved Thomas still, would always love him. But he was gone, and she was still here, still young, still alive. Squaring her shoulders, Pearl turned and walked toward the general store, preparing herself for whatever gossip might await her return. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. Mondays and Thursdays were spent at the Rockingham, where Pearl gradually restored order to the ranch house and established a warm friendship with Alina Morris. Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, she continued her laundry and mending work in town. Saturdays were devoted to caring for Samuel and her tiny room, while Sundays found her slipping into church just as services began and leaving immediately after. Dustin was always punctual, arriving precisely at 8 on the appointed mornings to escort Pearl to the ranch. Their conversations during these rides grew increasingly personal as Pearl learned about Dustin's years on the trail and shared stories of her own childhood in Boston. "So what brought you to Montana?" Pearl asked one crisp October morning as they rode through a grove of aspen trees, their golden leaves shimmering in the sunlight. "You said you're originally from Kentucky, but you rode in from Wyoming." Dustin adjusted his hat, considering the question. "Restlessness, I suppose. After my siblings were grown, there was nothing to keep me in one place. I've cowboyed all over Texas, Colorado, Kansas, Wyoming, but something about this country." He gestured to the mountains rising in the distance. "It feels different, like maybe a man could put down roots here." There was something in his tone that made Pearl glance at him sharply. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, his profile strong against the blue sky. Pearl found herself noticing the way his dark hair curled at the nape of his neck, the tiny lines at the corners of his eyes from years squinting in the sun. "And you?" Dustin asked, turning to catch her studying him. "Will you stay in Montana? Once Samuel's a bit older, I mean." Pearl considered the question. "I think so. Despite everything, this feels like home now. Thomas is buried here, and I want Samuel to grow up knowing where his father rests." Dustin nodded, understanding in his eyes. It's good for a boy to have that connection. They fell silent then, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the ranch house, Dustin suddenly said, "Would you sing something, Mrs. Jenkins, before we arrive?" Pearl hesitated, surprised by the request. "Please," he added softly. "It would mean a great deal to me." How could she refuse such a simple request, especially given what he had shared about his mother? Pearl began to sing an old English folk song, her clear voice rising in the morning air. "Early one morning, just as the sun was rising, I heard a maiden sing in the valley below. Oh, don't deceive me. Oh, never leave me. How could you use a poor maiden so?" The melancholy melody seemed to hang in the air between them, the words taking on a poignancy that Pearl hadn't intended. As the final notes died away, she felt Dustin's eyes on her, intense and questioning. "Thank you," he said simply. At the ranch house, Alina greeted them with the news that Malcolm had ridden to Helena on business and would be gone for several days. "Which means it's just us womenfolk and a skeleton crew of hands," she explained as they entered the kitchen. "Drake, you'll be needed to help with the south pasture fencing today." "Yes, madam," Dustin replied, his manner shifting to professional respect. "I'll be back to fetch Mrs. Jenkins by 4 o'clock." After he left, Alina gave Pearl a knowing look. "That young man rides 5 miles into town twice a week just to escort you out here, when any one of the hands could do it. You realize what that means, don't you?" Pearl busied herself with settling Samuel in his makeshift bed, avoiding Alina's gaze. "Mr. Drake is simply being kind," she said. "He knows I'm still in mourning for Thomas." Alina snorted softly. "Mourning doesn't change the way a person feels, Pearl. I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching, and how you look at him too." Pearl felt her face grow warm. "It's not appropriate," she murmured. "Thomas has been gone barely 4 months. Life is short out here," Alina said matter-of-factly. "Thomas would want you and Samuel taken care of, wouldn't he?" "Of course, but—" "No buts," Alina interrupted. "I'm not saying you should rush into anything. Just don't close your heart to possibilities because of what others might think. Now, let's get to work on those winter curtains. The drafts in this house would freeze a polar bear." As they worked side by side, sewing heavy curtains for the ranch house windows, Pearl found her thoughts returning to Dustin and the intensity in his eyes when she sang for him. There was something growing between them, something she wasn't ready to name but couldn't deny either. That evening, as Dustin escorted her back to town, storm clouds gathered on the western horizon. The temperature dropped sharply, and a cold wind began to blow across the open prairie. "We should hurry," Dustin said, frowning at the darkening sky. "That storm's moving fast." They urged their horses to a faster pace, but the storm overtook them when they were still a mile from Dry Creek. The first fat raindrops quickly became a downpour, accompanied by gusts of wind that cut through Pearl's thin shawl. Samuel, protected somewhat by his mother's body, began to wail in distress. "Over there," Dustin shouted over the howling wind, pointing to a small line shack barely visible through the curtain of rain. "We need to take shelter," Pearl nodded, too cold and wet to argue. They reached the shack, just as lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Dustin dismounted quickly and helped Pearl down, then led both horses to the lee side of the building where a crude overhang offered some protection from the elements. The line shack was basic, but found a single room with a small iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bunk against one wall. Dustin quickly set about starting a fire in the stove while Pearl tried to comfort the screaming Samuel. "Here," Dustin said, shrugging out of his heavy canvas coat. "Wrap the boy in this. It's damp on the outside but dry enough inside." Pearl gratefully accepted the coat, wrapping Samuel securely in its warm folds. The baby's cries subsided to hiccuping sobs as the chill left his tiny body. "Thank you," Pearl said, suddenly conscious of her own sodden condition. Her dress clung to her, and her hair had come loose from its pins, hanging in wet ropes down her back. "I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't spotted this place." "Just lucky I know this territory," Dustin replied, feeding another stick into the now crackling fire. He glanced at her and frowned. "You're soaked through. You'll catch your death if you stay in those wet clothes." Pearl clutched Samuel tighter, acutely aware of the impropriety of their situation. Alone in a remote shack with a man not her husband, in need of dry clothing, it was precisely the sort of scenario Cordelia Winters would love to condemn her for. As if reading her thoughts, Dustin said gently, "I'll step outside while you sort yourself out. There should be some spare clothes in that trunk by the bunk. Line riders keep extras here for emergencies. They won't be a proper fit, but they'll be dry." Without waiting for her response, he grabbed his hat and stepped out into the storm, pulling the door firmly closed behind him. Pearl hesitated only a moment before practicality overcame propriety. She laid Samuel, now contentedly gumming his fist, on the bunk and opened the trunk. Inside, she found several flannel shirts, a pair of denim trousers, and a woolen blanket. Quickly, she stripped off her sodden dress and petticoats, using her damp chemise to dry her skin before pulling on one of the flannel shirts. It hung almost to her knees, the sleeves dangling well past her fingertips. She rolled them back and then wrapped the blanket around her waist like a skirt. "Mr. Drake," she called, moving to the door, "you can come back in now." Dustin re-entered, water streaming from his hat and clothes. He took in her makeshift attire with a quick glance, then averted his eyes. "The horses are as sheltered as I can make them," he reported. "But this storm isn't letting up any time soon. We might be here for the night." Pearl's heart sank. Overnight in a lined shack with Dustin Drake, even Reverend Hallbrook's charitable nature would be strained to find innocence in such a situation. She thought of Samuel, however, and knew they had no choice. The baby's safety came before her reputation. "I understand," she said quietly. "Thank you for seeing to the horses." Dustin nodded, water still dripping from his clothes onto the rough plank floor. "I should get out of these wet things," he said awkwardly. "If you wouldn't mind turning your back for a moment." Pearl immediately complied, moving to sit on the bunk with Samuel, her back to the center of the room. She heard the rustle of wet clothing being removed, then the creak of the trunk lid as Dustin presumably found dry garments for himself. "All decent now," he announced after a few minutes. Pearl turned to find him dressed in dry denim and a faded red flannel shirt similar to the blue one she wore. His dark hair was damp and tousled, making him look younger somehow. He had spread his wet clothes near the stove alongside her dress, which he must have picked up from the floor. "I found some coffee and beans in the cupboard," he said, gesturing to the small shelf above the stove. "Not much of a supper, but it'll warm us up." "That sounds wonderful," Pearl replied, genuinely grateful. Samuel was getting fussy again, a sure sign he was hungry. "I need to feed the baby," she added, a blush rising in her cheeks. "Of course," Dustin said immediately, turning to busy himself with preparing the coffee. "You just let me know when you're finished." Pearl appreciated his discretion as she loosened the oversized shirt and allowed Samuel to nurse. The baby suckled hungrily, his tiny hands patting against her skin. Pearl began to sing softly, the same lullaby she'd been singing the night Thomas died, when he'd left for the evening shift at the mine with a smile and a kiss, never to return. "Sleep, my child, and peace attend thee, all through the night. Guardian angels God will send thee, all through the night." The sweet melody filled the small space, mingling with the sound of rain drumming on the roof and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. When she finished, she looked up to find Dustin watching her, something like reverence in his expression. "I'm sorry," she said, misinterpreting his silence. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "No," he said quickly. "It's just your voice. It's like nothing I've ever heard. Makes a man believe in heaven." Pearl felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. "You're too kind," she murmured, adjusting her clothing as Samuel finished nursing and dozed off against her shoulder. Dustin turned back to the stove, where the coffee was beginning to boil. "Not kindness, Mrs. Jenkins, just truth." He poured the strong black brew into 2 tin cups and brought one to Pearl. "Careful, it's hot." Their fingers brushed as she took the cup, and Pearl felt that same strange flutter in her chest that had been occurring with increasing frequency in Dustin's presence. She sipped the coffee, grateful for its warmth, while Dustin settled into one of the chairs, stretching his long legs toward the stove. Outside, the storm continued to rage with no sign of abating. Pearl gently laid Samuel on the bunk and covered him with a corner of the blanket, then moved to sit in the other chair. "Will anyone worry about you not returning to the ranch tonight?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. Dustin shook his head. "Eleanor will guess we took shelter from the storm. She won't expect me back until morning." He hesitated, then added, "I'm more concerned about how this will appear to folks in town." "Your reputation, my reputation, is already in tatters, according to Cordelia Winters," Pearl said with a hint of bitterness. "Apparently, a widow who sings to her child and speaks to a cowboy by a creek is beyond the pale of decent society." Dustin's face darkened. "That woman should mind her own business. There's nothing improper about singing or being civil to folks." "Not in a rational world," Pearl agreed. "But Dry Creek isn't always rational. After Thomas died, I thought people would be kind, supportive. Some were Reverend and Mrs. Holbrook, Sheriff Miller, but others." She shook her head sadly. "It's as if my widowhood makes me both pitiable and suspect at the same time." "People fear what they don't understand," Dustin said quietly, "and sorrow makes them uncomfortable. Easier to judge than to offer real help." Pearl looked at him with new appreciation. For a man who'd spent most of his life on cattle drives and in bunkhouses, Dustin Drake showed remarkable insight into human nature. "May I ask you something personal, Mr. Drake?" "Dustin," he corrected gently. "If we're going to be trapped together all night, we might as well use first names, Mrs. Jenkins." Pearl smiled slightly. "Pearl, then, and yes, my question. Have you ever been married or close to it?" Dustin stared into his coffee cup for a long moment. "Once," he finally said. "In Wyoming." "Her name was Sarah, daughter of the ranch owner I worked for. We were sweet on each other for nearly a year, planned to marry that spring." "What happened?" Pearl asked softly, sensing a sadness in his voice. "Winter happened. Worst blizzard in 20 years. I was out with the herd when it hit, got trapped in a lined shack not unlike this one for nearly 2 weeks. By the time I made it back to the ranch, pneumonia had taken her." He looked up, meeting Pearl's sympathetic gaze. "That was 5 years ago. Haven't let myself get close to anyone since then." "I'm so sorry, Dustin," Pearl said, reaching across the small table to touch his hand briefly. "To lose someone you love that way. Like you losing Thomas," he said. "Different circumstances, same pain." They sat in companionable silence for a time, each lost in memories of lost love. Outside, the storm began to diminish, the thunderous crashes fading to distant rumbles. "You should try to get some sleep," Dustin eventually said. "Take the bunk with Samuel. I'll be fine in this chair." Pearl knew she should protest, offer to share the small space, but propriety held her back. Instead, she nodded gratefully and moved to the bunk, curling her body protectively around her sleeping son. Dustin added more wood to the stove, then settled back in his chair, hat pulled low over his eyes. "Good night, Dustin," Pearl murmured, already drifting toward sleep. "Good night, Pearl," came the soft reply. "Sweet dreams." Pearl woke to pale sunlight streaming through the single small window of the lined shack. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then Samuel stirred beside her, and the events of the previous day came flooding back. She sat up quickly, looking around the small space. Dustin was gone, but the stove still radiated heat, indicating he'd stoked it recently. Pearl's dress hung near it, now completely dry. She got up carefully, trying not to disturb Samuel, and quickly changed back into her own clothing, folding the borrowed shirt neatly and returning it to the trunk. The door opened, and Dustin entered, bringing with him the fresh scent of rain-washed air. "Good morning," he said, doffing his hat. Storms passed. Skies clear all the way to town. Good morning, Pearl replied, suddenly shy in the light of day. Had she really shared such personal conversations with this man last night? Had she actually allowed him to call her by her first name? Is it very late? People will be wondering where we are. Sun's just up, Dustin assured her. We'll be in town before most folks are stirring. I've saddled the horses and found some jerky in the cupboard. Not much of a breakfast, but it'll tide us over. They ate quickly, neither mentioning the intimacy of the previous night's conversation. Dustin seemed to understand Pearl's return to formality, responding with corresponding politeness as they prepared to leave. The ride to town was made in near silence, both lost in their own thoughts. As they reached the outskirts of Dry Creek, Pearl finally spoke. "Mr. Drake, Dustin, about last night. I hope you know I value your discretion regarding our situation." Dustin glanced at her, his blue eyes serious. "You have nothing to fear from me, Pearl. I would never do anything to harm your reputation." "I know," she said simply. "Thank you." They parted ways at the edge of town, Pearl continuing on to her room above the general store while Dustin headed back toward the Rockingham. Neither noticed Cordelia Winters watching from the window of the bank, her thin face pinched with malicious speculation. The consequences of their innocent night of storm shelter became apparent the following Sunday. Pearl arrived at church to find whispered conversations falling silent as she entered, with pointed looks and barely concealed smirks following her progress to her usual back pew. Reverend Holbrook conducted the service as usual, but even he seemed to avoid meeting Pearl's eyes during his sermon, which focused pointedly on the virtues of propriety and the dangers of temptation. Pearl sat rigid with embarrassment, clutching Samuel to her chest like a shield. After the final hymn, she rose quickly, hoping to escape before anyone could confront her directly. But Cordelia Winters blocked her path, flanked by several ladies from the Aid Society. "Mrs. Jenkins," Cordelia said, her voice carrying clearly in the now quiet church. "The Ladies' Aid Society feels it necessary to address your recent behavior." Pearl straightened her spine, aware of every eye upon her. "I was unaware that taking shelter from a life-threatening storm constituted behavior requiring address, Mrs. Winters." Cordelia's thin lips tightened. "Don't play innocent with us. You were seen returning to town at dawn, wearing the same dress you left in the previous day, escorted by that cowboy. Alone, unchaperoned, overnight. The implications are obvious to anyone with a modicum of moral sense." Hot color flooded Pearl's cheeks, not from guilt but from fury. "The only implication is that Mr. Drake acted as a gentleman to protect a woman and child from a dangerous storm," she said, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "But of course, you would prefer I had risked my son's life rather than accept help from a decent man." "Decent," Cordelia scoffed. "A drifting cowboy with no roots and no reputation to speak of. Really, Mrs. Jenkins, if you must throw yourself at a man so soon after your husband's death, you might at least choose one with prospects." Pearl gasped at the crude accusation. "How dare you?" she whispered, trembling now with rage. "How dare you suggest such a thing? Mr. Drake has been nothing but respectful and kind, which is more than I can say for those who claim to be pillars of Christian charity in this town." Cordelia drew herself up, her face mottled with anger. "Well, I never. That's quite enough, Mrs. Winters." The deep voice from the church doorway silenced Cordelia mid-sentence. Dustin stood there, hat in hand, his expression thunderous as he surveyed the scene before him. "Mr. Drake," Reverend Holbrook said nervously, "this is a private church matter." "With all due respect, Reverend, I can't stand by while Mrs. Jenkins is slandered for circumstances beyond her control." Dustin strode down the center aisle, stopping beside Pearl. "If anyone wishes to cast blame for our taking shelter during that storm, let them direct it at me. I made the decision, and I'd make it again to protect Mrs. Jenkins and her child from harm." "No one is questioning your intentions, Mr. Drake," Reverend Holbrook began diplomatically. "Aren't they?" Dustin interrupted, his gaze moving pointedly to Cordelia. "Seems to me that's exactly what's happening here. So let me be clear. Mrs. Jenkins is a lady of impeccable character who has faced more hardship with dignity and grace than most folks could imagine. She deserves respect, not gossip." Pearl stared at Dustin, moved beyond words by his defense. In that moment, with sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows to illuminate his resolute face, she realized the truth that had been growing in her heart for weeks. She was falling in love with this quiet, honorable cowboy. "Furthermore," Dustin continued, his voice carrying throughout the church, "Mrs. Jenkins' singing, which some of you have criticized as unseemly, saved my soul once." A murmur ran through the congregation at this unexpected statement. "I heard her singing to her baby by the creek that first Sunday I arrived in Dry Creek. I was at the lowest point of my life, contemplating ending it all after years of wandering with nothing to show for it. Her voice reached something inside me that I thought was dead and gone. It reminded me that beauty still exists in this world, even alongside sorrow." He looked directly at Pearl now, his blue eyes intense. "Her song saved my soul, and I'll not stand by while anyone tries to silence her or shame her for it." The church fell completely silent, every person present struck by the raw emotion in Dustin's declaration. Pearl felt tears gathering in her eyes, overwhelmed by his words and the courage it must have taken to speak them. "Well," Reverend Holbrook said after a long moment, clearing his throat, "I believe we have all been reminded today of the danger of hasty judgment and the power of grace. Mrs. Winters, ladies, I suggest we consider this matter closed. Mrs. Jenkins has suffered enough loss without adding the burden of unwarranted criticism." Cordelia looked as if she wanted to protest, but the mood of the congregation had shifted palpably. Even her usual supporters seemed uncomfortable now, avoiding her gaze. With a huff of indignation, she gathered her skirts and swept from the church, her followers trailing uncertainly behind. As the church emptied, Pearl remained rooted in place, Samuel sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, unaware of the drama surrounding him. Dustin stood beside her, silent now that his piece had been said. "Thank you," Pearl finally whispered. "No one has defended me like that since Thomas died." Dustin nodded, a muscle working in his jaw. It needed saying, "Those people." He shook his head in disgust. "They don't deserve your songs." Pearl felt a smile tugging at her lips despite the intensity of the moment. "Are you suggesting I should only sing for you, Mr. Drake?" A slow grin spread across his face, transforming his serious expression. "Well now, that would be mighty selfish of me, wouldn't it, though I can't say I'd mind." Reverend Holbrook approached them, his expression contrite. "Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Drake, I want to apologize for what happened here today. I should have intervened sooner." "It's not your fault, Reverend," Pearl assured him. "Some people will always find reasons to judge others. Nevertheless, I hope you know that you are always welcome in this church, both of you." The Reverend glanced between them with shrewd understanding. "And may I say, Mr. Drake, that was quite a testimony you shared. God works in mysterious ways, bringing healing through unexpected channels." After the Reverend left them, Pearl and Dustin walked out into the bright autumn sunshine. The streets of Dry Creek were quiet, most residents still at their Sunday dinners. "Would you care to join me for a walk by the creek?" Dustin asked hesitantly. It's a fine day, and the little one could use some fresh air. Pearl knew she should refuse. Despite Dustin's passionate defense, the town gossips would have a field day if she was seen walking alone with him so soon after the church confrontation. But something had shifted inside her, a newfound courage born of Dustin's words. Why should she deny herself simple pleasures because of others' narrow-mindedness? "I would like that very much," she said, smiling up at him. "Lead the way, Mr. Drake." They walked in companionable silence until they reached the creek, following its winding path away from town to the spot where they had first met. The same flat rock where Pearl had sat singing to Samuel was still there, bathed now in golden autumn light. "May I hold him?" Dustin asked, gesturing to Samuel, who was awake now and looking around with wide, curious eyes. Pearl hesitated only briefly before passing her son to the cowboy. Dustin cradled the baby with practiced ease, speaking to him in a low, gentle voice as he pointed out a hawk circling high above. Samuel reached up a tiny hand, grasping at Dustin's finger when he offered it, and the cowboy's face softened with an expression that made Pearl's heart turn over. "He likes you," she observed, sitting down on the rock and spreading her skirts around her. "Smart boy," Dustin replied with a grin. "Takes after his mama." He settled beside her, careful to keep a respectable distance between them despite their isolation. "Pearl," he said after a moment, "I meant what I said in that church. Your singing. It reached something in me I thought was long dead." Pearl looked at him, taking in the earnest blue eyes, the strong profile, the gentle way he held her son. "I believe you," she said softly, "and I'm grateful. But Dustin, I'm still mourning Thomas. I don't know if I'm ready for whatever this is between us." Dustin nodded, no disappointment visible in his expression. "I understand that. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, just the chance to be near you, to hear you sing sometimes, maybe to be a friend to you and Samuel while you figure things out." The simple honesty of his request touched Pearl deeply. "I would like that," she admitted. "To have you as a friend. Samuel needs good men in his life, men like his father was, like you are." Dustin looked down at the baby in his arms, a curious expression crossing his face. "You know," he said slowly, "I've been thinking about putting down roots. Malcolm's offered me a permanent position at the Rocking M, with the chance to build my own place on the northwest section of the property. Good grazing land with a view of the mountains." Pearl's breath caught at the implications of this statement. "That sounds wonderful, Dustin. You'd be an asset to any ranch." "I'd need someone to help make it a home, though," he continued, his eyes still on Samuel. "Not right away, when the time is right, if the right person was interested." It wasn't a proposal, not quite, but it was a declaration of intent, a promise of possibilities to come. Pearl felt a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying lift from her shoulders. She didn't need to decide anything today. Dustin was offering friendship now, with the potential for more when she was ready. It was a gift she hadn't expected but suddenly realized she desperately wanted. "Would you sing something, Pearl?" Dustin asked, breaking the charged silence between them. "For Samuel, and for me." Pearl smiled and began to sing, her clear voice rising above the sound of the flowing creek, carrying out across the open prairie beneath the vast Montana sky. As she sang, she watched Dustin with her son, saw the tenderness in his eyes, and felt the first tentative unfurling of new love in her heart. Over the weeks that followed, Pearl continued to work at the Rocking M on Mondays and Thursdays, but now she also joined the Morris family for Sunday dinners after church. Dustin was always there, a quiet, steady presence that gradually became essential to her happiness. Cordelia Winters and her cronies continued to whisper behind their hands whenever Pearl passed, but with a leaner Morris and Sheriff Miller's wife openly supporting her. The worst of the gossip died down. Even Reverend Hallbrook made a point of mentioning in his sermons the Christian virtues of charity and withholding judgment, with pointed looks toward Cordelia's usual pew. As winter approached, Dustin began construction on his own cabin on the northwest section of the Rocking M property. Pearl found herself involved in the planning, offering suggestions about the kitchen layout and window placements. They never directly discussed that the cabin might one day be her home too, but the possibility hung in the air between them, warm and full of promise. Samuel grew stronger and more alert with each passing day. He began to recognize Dustin, his little face lighting up with a gummy smile whenever the cowboy appeared. The first time he reached for Dustin instead of Pearl, she felt a bittersweet pang joy at her son's obvious affection for the gentle cowboy, mixed with sadness that Thomas would never know this moment. "He'd be proud of his boy," Dustin said quietly, reading her expression as he took Samuel in his arms. "And proud of you, too, for being such a fine mother to him." The first snow fell in early December, blanketing Dry Creek in pristine white. Christmas was approaching, and despite her limited funds, Pearl was determined to make it special for Samuel's first holiday. She worked extra hours sewing gifts for the Morris family and carefully saved pennies to buy a small toy for her son. One evening, as she sat by her window mending a shirt and singing softly to Samuel, who was playing with a wooden spoon on a blanket nearby, a knock sounded at her door. Pearl opened it to find Dustin standing there, snowflakes melting on his hat and shoulders. "Dustin." "I wasn't expecting you today," she said, stepping back to let him enter. "I was in town for supplies," he explained, stomping his boots to remove excess snow. "Thought I'd stop by to see how you and the little man are doing." Samuel squealed with delight at the sight of Dustin, raising his arms to be picked up. Dustin obliged, swinging the baby high before settling him against his chest. "He's getting so big," Dustin observed, genuine pride in his voice. "Going to be as tall as his pa, I reckon." Pearl smiled, warmed by Dustin's consistent acknowledgement of Thomas' place in Samuel's life. "I think so too. He has Thomas' build, long and lean." Dustin nodded, then reached into his coat pocket with his free hand. "Got something for you," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "An early Christmas gift, you might say." He handed Pearl a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Open it," he urged when she hesitated. Pearl carefully untied the string and unwrapped the paper to reveal a small wooden box, beautifully carved with wildflowers around the edges. When she lifted the lid, a soft melody began to play Greensleeves, one of the lullabies she often sang to Samuel. "A music box," she breathed, touched beyond words. "Dustin, it's beautiful, but this must have cost. Don't worry about that," he interrupted gently. "I've been saving. Ordered it special from Helena when Malcolm went to do business there last month." He shifted Samuel to his other arm, his expression suddenly serious. "There's something else, too. Look under the velvet lining." Pearl's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the red velvet that cushioned the music box's mechanism. Beneath it lay a simple gold band with a small pearl set in the center. "I'm not asking for an answer now," Dustin said quickly, before Pearl could speak. "I know it's too soon. Thomas hasn't been gone a year yet, and you need time. But I wanted you to have this, to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be waiting." Pearl stared at the ring, a whirlwind of emotions rushing through her. Grief for Thomas, joy at Dustin's declaration, anxiety about the future, hope for possibilities she hadn't dared consider all collided in her heart at once. "I don't know what to say," she whispered finally. "You don't need to say anything," Dustin assured her, shifting Samuel back to his arms. "Just keep it. Think about it. I'll be here, Pearl, whenever you decide. If you never want to wear it, that's all right too. I'll still be here for you and Samuel however you'll have me." Pearl looked up at him then, this man who had defended her reputation, who sang off key to make her son laugh, who was building a home with extra windows because he knew she loved sunlight. In that moment, she knew what her answer would be, even if she wasn't quite ready to give it. "Thank you, Dustin," she said, carefully replacing the ring under the velvet and closing the music box. "It's the most thoughtful gift I've ever received." Dustin's smile lit his entire face, the dimple appearing in his right cheek. "I'm glad you like it." He glanced at the window, where snow was now falling heavily. "I should get back to the ranch before this gets worse. The cabin's almost finished, roofs on, chimneys built. Just need to finish the inside work before spring." As he handed Samuel back to Pearl and prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. Would you sing something before I go, to take with me through the storm?" Pearl nodded, settling Samuel on her hip. She began to sing Greensleeves, the same melody the music box played, but infinitely sweeter in her clear voice. Dustin stood motionless, drinking in the sound as if storing it away for the cold ride ahead. When she finished, he touched her cheek with gentle fingers. "That voice of yours," he murmured. "It's like hearing heaven itself." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Pearl with the lingering warmth of his touch on her skin and the weight of possibility in her heart. Christmas came, bringing with it a festive gathering at the Rocking M. Alina had insisted that Pearl and Samuel join them, sending Dustin to fetch them early on Christmas morning. The ranch house was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons. A tall tree standing in the corner of the main room, adorned with candles and handmade ornaments. Pearl felt a twinge of envy at the family atmosphere. Malcolm and Alina's grown children had returned for the holiday, filling the house with laughter and stories. She thought of her own small room above the general store, where she and Samuel would have spent a quiet, modest Christmas alone if not for the Morrises' invitation. "Stop thinking so hard," Dustin murmured, appearing at her side with a cup of spiced cider. "Your face gets all scrunched up when you're worrying about things." Pearl accepted the cider with a small smile. "I was just thinking how different this Christmas is from what I expected when Thomas died. I never imagined finding this." She gestured vaguely around the room at the people who had become a surrogate family to her. "Good different or bad different?" Dustin asked, his blue eyes searching hers. "Good," Pearl admitted. "Complicated, but good." After a magnificent dinner, gifts were exchanged around the tree. Pearl was touched to receive practical items from the Morrises: warm gloves, fabric for new dresses, a set of cooking pots, as well as a beautiful cradle for Samuel, handcrafted by Malcolm himself. "For when you visit," Alina explained with a meaningful glance between Pearl and Dustin. "The boy's outgrowing that dresser drawer we've been using." When all the gifts had been opened, Malcolm cleared his throat importantly. "I have one more announcement to make," he said. "Dustin here has completed his cabin on the northwest section, and as of today, that land is officially his. I've signed over the deed as part of his payment for 2 years guaranteed work on the Rocking M." A cheer went up from the cowhands, and Alina beamed with approval. Pearl glanced at Dustin, who was watching her reaction carefully. Her fingers went unconsciously to the pocket of her dress, where she carried the ring he had given her, still nestled in its music box. She had taken to keeping it with her always, a talisman of future possibilities. As the evening wound down, Dustin offered to show Pearl his new cabin before taking her back to town. Alina volunteered to watch Samuel, who was already asleep in his new cradle, and Pearl found herself alone with Dustin for the first time in weeks as they rode through the snowy landscape toward the northwest section of the ranch. The cabin sat on a slight rise, with a view of the mountains to the west and the ranch buildings to the southeast. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, indicating that Dustin had prepared for their visit by starting a fire earlier in the day. "It's not much yet," Dustin said as he helped her down from her horse, "but it's sound and warm." Pearl followed him inside, immediately struck by how much larger and more comfortable the cabin was than her tiny room in town. A main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. 2 doors led off the main room, one to a bedroom, Pearl presumed, and the other perhaps to a storage area or second bedroom. But what caught her eye immediately were the windows, large, carefully placed to capture both morning and evening light, with deep sills that would be perfect for houseplants or sitting with mending. Just as she had suggested months ago during their theoretical discussions about the perfect home. "You remembered," she said softly, moving to touch one of the window frames, "about the light." Dustin stood in the center of the room, hat in hands, watching her explore. "I remembered everything you said, Pearl. This place, I built it with you in mind, you and Samuel." Pearl turned to face him, her heart pounding. "Dustin, I know it's too soon," he interrupted gently. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I just wanted you to see it, to know it's here waiting, like I am." Pearl moved toward him slowly, her mind made up at last. The months of grief, of struggle, of slowly rebuilding her life had led her to this moment, this man, this choice. Thomas would always be her first love, Samuel's father, a precious part of her past. But Dustin, steady, patient Dustin with his quiet strength and profound understanding, he could be her future. "It's not too soon," she said, stopping directly in front of him. "Not anymore." Dustin's breath caught, hope dawning in his blue eyes. "Pearl, are you saying?" She reached into her pocket and withdrew the music box, opening it to reveal the ring nestled beneath the velvet lining. The soft melody of Greensleeves filled the cabin as she held the ring out to him. "I'm saying yes, Dustin Drake. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll make this beautiful cabin a home with you. Yes, I'll sing for you every day for the rest of our lives if that's what you want." Dustin's face transformed with joy as he took the ring with trembling fingers. "Are you sure, Pearl?" "I don't want you to feel rushed," or Pearl silenced him by placing her fingers gently against his lips. "I'm sure. Thomas will always be part of me, part of Samuel, but my heart has room for new love too. For you." Dustin slipped the ring onto her finger, then cradled her face in his hands with infinite tenderness. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," he whispered. "Never thought I deserved it. But from the first moment I heard you singing by that creek, something changed inside me. Your voice brought me back to life, Pearl, and I'll spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of that gift." As snow fell softly outside the windows of the cabin that would soon be their home, Dustin lowered his lips to Pearl's in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together, a future filled with love, family, and songs sung in the warm glow of their own hearth. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers across the Montana prairie and preparations for a wedding. Pearl and Dustin had decided to marry in May, a year after Thomas' death, long enough to honor his memory, but not so long as to delay their future together unnecessarily. The wedding was held at the Rocking M, with Reverend Hallbrook officiating. Pearl wore a simple dress of pale blue silk that Alina had insisted on ordering from Helena, with wildflowers in her hair, and Samuel, now a sturdy 10-month-old, balanced on her hip. Dustin stood tall and proud in a new suit, his usually unruly dark hair tamed for the occasion, his blue eyes never leaving Pearl's face as they spoke their vows. Even Cordelia Winters attended, though her expression remained sour throughout the ceremony. Her influence in town had waned considerably since Dustin's defense of Pearl in church months earlier, and when the banker himself offered congratulations to the couple, his wife had little choice but to follow suit with stiff politeness. After the ceremony, as friends and neighbors gathered for the celebration, Dustin drew Pearl aside for a moment of privacy behind the ranch house. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small package from his pocket. "A wedding gift." Pearl unwrapped it to find a small leather-bound journal. Opening it, she discovered pages filled with Dustin's careful handwriting. "It's all the songs you've sung to Samuel this past year," he explained. "Every one I could remember. I wrote them down so they wouldn't be forgotten. So someday, when we have more children, you can sing them the same songs that saved their father's soul." Tears filled Pearl's eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift. "More children?" she asked with a teasing smile. "You seem very certain about that, Mr. Drake." Dustin grinned, the familiar dimple appearing in his cheek. "Well, Mrs. Drake, I'm certain about wanting them. The good Lord will decide if we're blessed that way." Pearl closed the book and held it to her heart. "Thank you, Dustin. It's perfect." She reached up to touch his face gently. "And yes, I'd like more children. Brothers and sisters for Samuel to grow up with the way you raised your siblings." Dustin's eyes darkened with emotion. "You've given me everything I never thought I'd have, Pearl. A home, a family, a future worth building." He glanced over to where Samuel was being fussed over by Alina and the other women. "That boy will know his father's memory, I promise you. I'll make sure he knows what a fine man Thomas Jenkins was." "I know you will," Pearl said softly. "And he'll be lucky to have you too, Dustin." No child could ask for a better father. They returned to their guests hand in hand, accepting congratulations and well wishes with grateful hearts. As the celebration continued into the evening, Malcolm Morris called for attention, raising his glass in a toast. "To Dustin and Pearl," he said, his deep voice carrying across the gathering. "May your home be blessed with love, laughter, and music for all the years to come. And children," Alina added with a sly smile. "Lots of children to fill that big cabin Dustin built." Laughter rippled through the crowd as glasses were raised. Pearl leaned against Dustin's solid warmth, contentment filling her heart as she looked around at the community that had become her family. Alina and Malcolm, Sheriff and Mrs. Miller, Reverend and Mrs. Holbrook, even the ranch hands who had accepted her so readily as part of Dustin's life. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit, and someone produced a fiddle. The cheerful strains of a dancing tune filled the air, and couples began to move to the music. Dustin led Pearl to the center of the impromptu dance floor, one arm around her waist, the other holding her hand. "I've never been much of a dancer," he admitted as they began to move together. "Neither have I," Pearl laughed. "We can learn together." They swayed more than danced, finding their own rhythm that had little to do with the fiddle's lively tempo. As other couples whirled around them, Dustin bent his head close to Pearl's ear. "Sing something," he whispered, "just for me." And there, in the circle of his arms, with the Montana stars beginning to appear overhead, Pearl sang softly, a love song as old as time itself. Her voice, clear and sweet, carried just far enough for Dustin to hear, a private gift from wife to husband on their wedding day. 5 years later, Pearl stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching Dustin teach 5-year-old Samuel to ride his very first pony. Her hands rested on her swollen belly, where their third child grew beneath her heart. 2-year-old Elizabeth Rose played at her feet, arranging pebbles in careful patterns while chattering to herself in a mixture of real words and toddler babble. The years had been good to them. Dustin had proven himself not just an excellent ranch hand, but a skilled horse trainer as well. With Malcolm Morris's backing, he had begun breeding and training horses on their section of the ranch, developing a reputation throughout the territory for quality stock. Pearl had continued to help Alina with the ranch house on occasion, but most of her time was devoted to their growing family and home. She had planted a garden that was the envy of the territory, with vegetables, herbs, and flowers in carefully tended beds. Inside, the cabin had become a true home, filled with handcrafted furniture, colorful quilts, and the constant music of children's laughter and Pearl's singing. Samuel had grown into a sturdy, thoughtful boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's gentle nature. Though he had no memories of Thomas, he knew the stories Pearl and Dustin shared, and a portrait drawn by a traveling artist hung in his bedroom, ensuring he would always know his birth father's face. Elizabeth Rose was pure Drake, from her stubborn chin to her startlingly blue eyes. Already she showed signs of inheriting her mother's voice, often singing made-up songs to her dolls and the barn cats that had become her special friends. And now, another child was on the way, due with the first snows of winter. Dustin was hoping for another boy to even the numbers, while Pearl secretly thought another daughter would be a fine addition to their family. Either way, the child would be welcomed with love and, of course, with songs. "Mama, look at me," Samuel called, sitting tall in the saddle as Dustin led the gentle pony in a circle. "I'm riding all by myself." "I see you, sweetheart," Pearl called back, her heart full of pride. "You're doing wonderfully." Elizabeth abandoned her pebbles and ran to the edge of the porch. "Me ride too," she demanded, her little face determined. "Me big enough." Dustin looked up at Pearl with a grin, shrugging as if to say, "What can I do? She's your daughter." Aloud he called, "Come on then, princess. You can sit in front of your brother for one turn around the yard." Pearl watched as Dustin lifted their daughter to sit in front of Samuel on the pony, his strong hands ensuring both children were secure. The sight of her husband with their children never failed to fill her with gratitude for the unexpected turn her life had taken that day by the creek, when a wandering cowboy had stopped to compliment her singing. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Pearl and Dustin sat on the porch swing Dustin had built the previous summer. The Montana night spread around them, a tapestry of stars against the velvet sky, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the soft creak of the swing. "I received a letter from Reverend Holbrook today," Pearl said, leaning comfortably against Dustin's side. "Cordelia Winters has left Dry Creek. Apparently, Mr. Winters finally tired of her sharp tongue and has sent her back east to her sister." Dustin chuckled softly. "Can't say I'm sorry to hear it. That woman caused you nothing but grief." Pearl nodded thoughtfully. "In a strange way, though, I should thank her. If she hadn't criticized my singing that day, you might never have defended me. We might not be sitting here now, with our children asleep inside and another on the way." "Oh, I'd have found a way to you somehow," Dustin said confidently, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Some things are just meant to be, Pearl Drake." Pearl smiled, remembering the frightened young widow she had been, trying to survive on her own with an infant son. How far she had come from those dark days of grief and uncertainty. Dustin had brought light back into her world, had given Samuel a father's love, had filled her life with purpose and joy beyond anything she could have imagined. "Sing for me," Dustin asked, as he did nearly every night. It had become their ritual, these moments of shared music under the stars. Pearl rested her head on his shoulder and began to sing the lullaby that had first drawn them together, her voice as clear and sweet as it had been that day by the creek. Dustin closed his eyes, a look of perfect contentment on his face as he listened to the wife who had once been a widow. shamed for singing to her baby the song that had saved his soul and given them both a second chance at love.